this idea that he has a very good relationship with Putin. So that in itself will lead to peace, and that will overcome any kind of Russian goals with the war that go beyond Putin, or the same thing about if we can just get Putin and Zelensky together in a room, they can talk it out.
Welcome back to The Focus. I'm John Bruni. This week, we're unpacking two extraordinary moments: the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska and the Trump-Ukraine-Europe summit at the White House. Were they breakthroughs or just theatre? And what do they mean for Ukraine, NATO, and Europe's security? To help cut through the noise, I'm joined once again by Commander Anders Puck Nielsen of the Royal Danish Navy. Anders is a leading military analyst at the Royal Danish Defence College, specialising in maritime strategy, NATO operations, and Russia's war in Ukraine. His clear-eyed commentary has made Anders one of the most respected European voices on modern warfare. He's here today to help us understand not just what happened, but why it matters. Anders, welcome back to The Focus.
Thank you for having me here again.
Anders, was the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska more than optics, or was it really just theatre dressed up as diplomacy? I mean, if it was theatre, who was the intended audience? Moscow, Washington, American voters, or Europe?
I think all actors have their own agenda in this. I don't think it was intended as theater from the Trump administration. I think Trump genuinely believed that he was onto something that could be a road to a quick peace deal. I think from the Russian side, it was probably more about the theatrics of the whole thing. They clearly see that they are very far. The Russians understand the substance of the war a lot better than the Americans do. They see how far the Russian and the Ukrainian positions are actually from each other, and they wanted to achieve different things with the theatrics of the whole thing. First and foremost, they wanted to just stall the process of negotiations and trying to pacify the United States by all the time keeping the negotiations going and waving this idea of, well, we might be close to a breakthrough if only, and that ensures that the United States is not providing a lot of military aid to Ukraine, and also it delays any sanctions that might be put on Russia. And then I think for Putin, it was just also very important politically to demonstrate that he can still travel the world and be, welcomed by the American president on U.S. soil and all those. It was a great photo opportunity. So that's very much served a purpose domestically in Russia. But I think Trump actually meant it. I think he genuinely believed that this might lead to something. The concern, at least here in Europe, before the whole thing, was that we were going to see Trump align very closely with the Russian viewpoint on how the war should be settled, and then after that would try to push this onto Ukraine and the European countries who would not have been part of the discussion and the conversation in Alaska. But basically that this was going to play out as some kind of Yalta 2.0, where the American and the Russian presidents would be sitting there drawing lines on a map and dividing Europe. And that did not happen. So I think actually, it looks like Trump genuinely believed that this might be something that could be fruitful.
But by generally thinking that he's going to be doing something fruitful, we are talking about a person who spent much of his career in front of the camera. So again, is there, do you think, some sort of subconscious uh, uh, aspect that drives him towards being the showman even when he's doing diplomacy? Because I mean, I couldn't help but observe the way that Trump welcomed Putin, the red carpets, the military planes on either side of Putin as he was walking down the red carpet, Trump applauding the Russian president coming down. It seemed a lot warmer than one would have imagined, especially if one were to believe that Trump really doesn't like the fact that Ukrainian children are being killed. And I mean, that seems to be a sticking point. So if that is really his sticking point, applauding a dictator who's conducting a war that's killing children, I don't know. The optics don't look too good on that.
You're absolutely right. And when I say that this was meant genuinely by Trump, and he probably had some ideas about how this could lead to peace, I mean that has to be understood in the context of Trump, right? That
Yeah.
everything about Trump is about show. It's not about substance. Um, John, he goes around there bragging about how he finished 6 wars, right? And he wants this one to be the number 7, right? Can anybody really name those 6? Well, I know we can name what the 6 ones that he claims to have
Mm.
finished, but it's very unclear that he has actually played any significant role in doing that, or that the wars have even stopped, right? That
Yeah.
several of them seem to continue. Um, and it's the same thing here, right? He does not care about the substance. He absolutely does not care about Ukraine's sovereignty, who gets to keep what territories, what are the future security guarantees going to be like. He just wants the fighting to stop, right? So nothing
Mhm.
about the substance, all about show, all about getting the Nobel Peace Prize. So in that
Yes.
sense, absolutely, it's theatrics. I also think Trump has a very sort of personalistic understanding of diplomacy and international relations. He genuinely seems to believe that the personal relationship between the leaders is perhaps more important than some inherent interests that the state will have. So this idea that he has a very good relationship with Putin, so that in itself will lead to peace, and that will overcome any kind of Russian uh, goals with the war that go beyond Putin, or the same thing about if we can just get Putin and Zelensky together in a room, they can talk it out. Like
Yeah.
these very simple understandings of sort of very superficial understandings of what the conflict is about. And obviously, that's also why it's a kind of doomed process, as I see it, what the American administration is trying to do, that it's not really going to lead to anything. We have actually seen over the last, I would say, weeks, sort of perhaps what could be interpreted as sort of a beginning understanding of some of the complexities. I think especially in some of the things that J.D. Vance has been talking about, where he can actually now, it seems, kind of pinpoint the problems that they disagree about, beyond the fact that there is something about a border in eastern Ukraine, but also the question about security guarantees, and this sort of growing understanding that this is something that also needs to be addressed, and that it's not just a war about where the border should be. So maybe it has like these it has opened some eyes in Washington. I don't know about how complicated this whole thing is, but still Trump goes around talking about how he still thinks that it's going to end any minute, and the meeting between Putin and Zelensky is just around the corner and those things. So well, we'll see.
Do you think that Trump and his cabinet, who are involved in trying to make these negotiations happen, do you think that there is a level of naivete within that cohort of American high officials, that they really don't quite get it, that somehow they're allowing Trump to just move ahead with whatever art of the deal process he's putting forward, but without, as you rightly point out, without having that understanding, that deep understanding of how nations work and what motivates them to do certain things. Because again, being a New York tycoon in real estate is a very different proposition to being a seasoned diplomat, like, for instance, coming across a figure like Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. I mean, there's a crafty old fox you'd not want to meet in a dark alley anytime soon. And what do we get? What do we, the public, get out of knowing this? I mean, if we know that there's a level of naivete working in the Trump administration, how confident should we be that peace will be achieved anytime soon?
I think you're pointing out something important, and that is that the level of incompetence in the current administration in the White House is just astonishing, right? They really don't know what they're talking about. And the people they sent to these things, I think Steve Witkoff is probably the worst example here of someone who's in no way qualified to be conducting these negotiations. The fact that they have, the cutbacks that they have made, the laying off um, civil servants in foreign the State Department, for example, like these things, all the people who actually know something about Russia, know something about the substance, they're not present there. I think probably the person with the biggest understanding in the room must have been Rubio, but I mean, he's not really what you would call a Russia specialist either, right? It's just uh, it's it, sometimes it's important, as I think kind of indicate here, that we remember to compare also this to the normal standards of what we would expect from U.S. diplomacy, and it's just it's awful. Like this, it's a huge failure, super embarrassing. Um, so, but but I think still, when I think there is a bit of the feeling here is a bit okay. It didn't lead to peace, but at least I will say it didn't really cause any big damage, and it's quite telling that this is where we are apparently when we are talking about American foreign policy here. That if they just don't do any damage, then that's probably okay. But I think that's where we are with this. I think with these meetings that many of the fears that people had before the Alaska meeting, they did not materialize, and we can say that we are more or less currently, it looks like we are more or less back to the kinds of structures around the support for Ukraine that existed before this, and I guess that's good.
You mentioned the American Vice President J.D. Vance, and we will get back to him, believe it. But, when we're talking about old foxes knowing diplomacy and foreign policy, you could possibly throw Putin into that category as well. There is a craftiness that the Russian leader has that can't be denied. It comes off him in the same way that the showmanship of Trump comes off him. They are products or they're creatures of their own environments and backgrounds. So saying that, did you think that Putin walked away with more than Trump in Alaska? And how will we actually know in the next 30 days? I mean, what concrete military or diplomatic signals should we be watching out for?
I think you're right to say that Putin is an old fox in this game and that he knows how these things work. I also think he came out of the meeting looking much more satisfied than Trump, and with a sense that he really got something out of this. And but in the big picture, I will say I think Putin actually got less than what he was probably aiming for. We didn't see sort of sanctions relief, for example, on Russia, which I think he would probably have liked to see if he could sort of get that in there some way that the Americans could do a sort of goodwill kind of thing or what have you. I also think he would have liked to really change the conversation to be something entirely different than about Ukraine, talking about arms control or what have you, all kinds of other things that he could talk with the American president about. And it seems the meeting was cut short. It was actually planned to be a lot longer. There was supposed to be kind of a working lunch, and then after that, a broader session where different kind of ministers would be talking as well. So the defense ministers, the ministers of finance, et cetera, were all present there in Alaska, and they actually never really got to meet and discuss anything. So it seems that there were plans that they would be having broader discussions about different topics, and this was just cut short. when
Mm.
it became clear that there was not going to be any sort of significant progress made on the topic of Ukraine. Um, so, in that sense, I don't really think Putin got all the things he wanted from it. And I think actually afterwards, it has become a kind of problem for Putin that Trump goes around telling the world that Putin made concessions that clearly Putin did not make, uh,
Yeah.
such as agreeing to meet Zelensky or agreeing that Ukraine can have robust security guarantees after a peace settlement and those kinds of things. Lavrov has been all over the American news after this, trying to explain that Putin did not actually say these things, but still Donald
Mm.
Trump goes around and says that, oh, he absolutely did, and he's happy with these things. So I actually think it is becoming a problem for the Russians that the American president is sort of in one way setting expectations that they already made these concessions that clearly they are not prepared to make at this point, but it can be difficult for them to get out of that. So I'm not sure that it's going to be long term super good for Russia, but well, they did manage though to stall the process and all the talk about more sanctions and secondary tariffs and all that existed before that went away. So.
So from the frosty climes of Alaska, we move to that other summit in the more temperate part of Washington, D.C. So, Anders, at the Trump Ukraine slash Europe summit, did the display of transatlantic unity mean anything significant, or was it just a photo op to calm nerves? I mean, if it's just optics, how quickly might cracks in the facade reemerge?
I think it. I think something was significant was achieved there. I think if you look at just the photos of who was actually present there, it showed very strong support from Europe for Ukraine's cause. I
Mm.
think if that had not happened, I think there is a good chance that uh, Trump would really have put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to give some very significant concessions. But the fact that the Europeans were there to back Zelensky and to send the message that well, we're going to support, we're going to continue supporting Ukraine, right? They are not
Mm.
alone, right? Zelensky has cards on his hand. That this changed the direction of this meeting and ensured that unity was kind of maintained here. It just became clear to the American side that there is no practical way forward in terms of pushing Ukraine into this. And
Mm.
if they if they do that, it's going to create a serious political crisis between Europe and the United States. And they were not prepared to do that. So I think that's how we can see much of that. So even though on the outside we can say what came out of it was again a kind of status quo kind of thing, but considering the expectations going into that meeting, then I think status quo was actually a pretty significant result.
In your opinion, do you think that the Europeans can sustain this unity? You know, we are talking about countries that have more than just Ukraine on their mind. There are the economic problems that all countries of Western Europe seem to be facing. There's the immigration crisis that seems to also be, getting people very hot under the collar. And once those two more domestic issues come together in that constellation of, oh my God, can Europe actually have a united stance on Ukraine that is necessary to keep Ukraine from being rolled over by both Russia and America, diplomatically speaking?
I think so. I mean, definitely we have seen the Europeans stepping up and more or less replacing the United States over the last 8 months or so in providing the aid to Ukraine. And that's of course also why this idea of having a summit between Putin and Trump without all the European countries is absolutely ridiculous. This idea
Yeah.
that these two people could decide the conditions of a peace deal without actually consulting the countries that are supporting Ukraine in this. That's quite strange. And we have seen in terms of just the material support, we can see Europe has stepped up. And then the question is about supporting this level. But I think actually the prognosis is kind of good on this because we are seeing the European defense industry also now, it was a slow start of getting this this boosted, but we are seeing the results now. So more is rolling out from European factories, and especially the investments are now also being made in Ukraine. So a lot of cooperation between Western European defense companies and Ukrainian partners. I think this is all significant. I also think if we go back to this thing we talked about before, that states actually have interests, and it's not all just about personal sort of sympathies between the state leaders. That it's significant that, or it seems that more and more European countries start to realize how dependent we are on Ukraine. So it's not only them that depend on us and need our assistance. We actually need Ukraine because we cannot rely on the United States. And Ukraine has the biggest army in Europe, right?
Yeah.
If we don't count the Russian one, I think the Russian one is probably bigger, but we're not going to be like that's. They are the enemy of the countries that we could meaningfully align with. Then Ukraine has the biggest army in Europe, and we need the Ukrainian army to be on our side going forward in terms of being able to put up a robust deterrence against Russia. So I think the security guarantees that people are now talking so much about, it's really going to turn into a conversation more about a future European security architecture where these security guarantees actually go both ways. So it's not only about Western European countries somehow guaranteeing the security of Ukraine, but also Ukraine committing to assisting if any other European country gets into trouble. And that is something that could meaningfully change the calculation in Moscow in terms of, for example, the security of the Baltic states or those things. If they also have to think about, okay, what if Ukraine gets involved here?
I have to tap your brain for something because this thought's been on my mind for quite some time. We don't really know just how the war is affecting Russia economically. We can suspect that we know, but the kind of information that we get from Russia is not reliable. They keep on putting themselves up, saying that we've got a wartime economy, we can outlast the Ukrainians, and we can pose a threat to the rest of Europe if we need to at any given point in time. How real do you think those claims are? Because if there is significant damage being done to the Russian economy as a consequence of this war, what will we be looking for in their ability to push forward in Ukraine? And this will have to come down to some sort of bargaining position as well, because if they're getting close to the end of what they can put onto the table militarily, there is going to have to be some sort of negotiated settlement that may not go 100% their way, but at least it'll be something that can bring most of the fighting to halt. And the real question is it really true that Russia would be able to rapidly repair its military after the Ukraine war is over in a ceasefire, a frozen conflict, whatever, that they could pose another threat to, say, the Baltics or any other place in Europe for that matter?
There are a lot of things to unpack in what you just said. I think the Russian war economy is definitely struggling. I think that is quite clear. Currently, they are being. If we just look at the economy of Russia, pretty much everything looks very bleak. They've had kind of a bit of an improvement in certain areas over the summer but that's just sort of seasonal fluctuations. Just the fact that potatoes are cheaper in the summer and those kinds of things. I think many people are expecting that once we get closer to the autumn into the winter, that the Russian economy is going to be really, really struggling. And if Ukraine can keep up the attacks that they're making on the Russian economy in terms of strikes on Russian oil production and those things, then I think that is something that could potentially force Russia into ending the war sometime, maybe next year.
Yep.
I also think, though, that it's important to be aware that Putin is going to prioritize the military, that like he will be willing to sacrifice almost anything else in Russian society to be able to keep on fighting. So it's quite from hurting the Russian war economy and that then translating into Russia losing the ability to keep fighting. It's there are several steps involved there, and probably what we're going to see is that other sectors in the Russian society are going to be suffering before that. But I think it can push Putin into making some of those dramatic choices or decisions that he has postponed, that he has really tried not to make, such as going for full-scale mobilization, for example, those kinds of things. But I'm always struggling to try to sort of bring together these two seemingly contradicting ideas that, on the one hand, Russia is fragile and they are approaching a point where they're running out of resources and it's really hard for them to make progress on the battlefield in Ukraine, right? So they can't capture Pokrovsk, right? And if they can't take Pokrovsk in Donetsk region, why would they be a threat to like Lithuania or Estonia, right? They're not going to take Tallinn if they can't take Pokrovsk, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, I think it's a huge mistake to underestimate what the kind of damage that Russia could also do to NATO if they decide to do that. So we have to reconcile these two ideas that, on the one hand, right now, Russia is struggling with the war they're fighting, and they don't have endless resources to do that. But on the other hand, they will be able to rebuild quite quickly. The moment they stop taking losses and they stop spending ammunition and those things, they are going to be building stockpiles really quickly. Like they are producing an enormous number of Shahed drones, for example, every month. The moment they stop using those in Ukraine, they are going to be stockpiling those, and they can pretty quickly turn that into a broader war on Europe. And then I think also really important to keep in mind is that the biggest problem that the European NATO countries actually have is the willpower to fight, the way I see it. So if everyone stands together, we could probably win such a war against Russia, but it would require massive casualties and the resources that would need to be put into that. It would be something that would entirely change our societies, and we would be victims of those kinds of airstrikes that Ukraine is suffering right now. Like all those Shahed drones would be hitting Copenhagen and Birmingham and what have you, right? So I think there is a significant risk that we are susceptible to that kind of coercion into not fighting. And because if you are a politician in, say, the Netherlands or the United Kingdom, right, you could just choose not to fight, right? You promised that you would declare war on Russia if they invade a NATO country, such as Finland or Latvia, right? But you still have the opportunity of just not doing it. And if that happens, then that will totally change how European security works. It would be the end of NATO. It would be the end of the European security order that we know it. And unfortunately, I think it is possible that the Russians might play on that and put to the test the willingness of European countries to actually fight. And that would not necessarily require enormous resources from a Russian perspective. They could test that and challenge the European countries with much less resources than they are currently using in Ukraine. So,
And of course, if they did that, Anders, if they did do that, and Article 5 didn't come into play for whatever reason, maybe because the Russians are playing at a far lower level, and so the Europeans don't believe it's in their interest to escalate beyond a certain point, then we come back to what you said earlier. This is a grave threat to NATO. NATO may fall because all of a sudden the Russians have pushed the button. NATO didn't respond in the way that was expected. Article 5 is finished, as is NATO.
exactly. I think there are too many people who say, well, the real threat is not really the Article 5 thing, it's the hybrid thing. But I disagree with that. I think the biggest threat is actually something that ought to trigger Article 5, but where many countries will just say, yeah, let's not do that. Or
Yeah.
where they will be unwilling to keep doing it for like committing forces for that for long enough. Just they maybe they will be a lot of things going on the first couple of weeks, but after 2 months we run out of resources or willpower to keep fighting, then you know so I'm quite pessimistic, but it can be difficult to you know keep these two thoughts in the head at the same time, that on the one hand
Yeah.
Russia is weak and they are really struggling in Ukraine, and the way that things are going, I don't actually see them winning in Ukraine currently. I actually see them being on path to losing that war. But on the other hand, also keeping in mind that they are a huge threat to the whole European world order, and
I
the
suppose one
model
thing.
that we've built.
Sorry, Anders. I suppose one thing that springs to mind. I mean, we here in Australia have just come out of a hybrid attack. The Iranians had launched not by themselves directly. They directed things apparently as far away as Tehran, but they managed to recruit or outsource anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish um, attacks on in Jewish infrastructure and places of worship through third parties like members of outlaw motorcycle gangs or other criminal groups and thugs that they can pay off quite silently. Is this a growing concern now as well? Because even if, say, we end up having a frozen conflict, the war between Russia and Greater Europe could still continue, but not as a kinetic war, but more so in this kind of outsourcing violence to criminal groups, which makes it very difficult to determine that they're actually a strategic threat because it's a law and order threat. And we're not very good at balancing and separating these two issues from each other, which leaves our communities rather vulnerable, but in a different sort of way, not from an invasion or a bombing threat, but from, just thugs being recruited by, various agents overseas.
Absolutely. I mean, that is already happening. The hybrid thing is all over the place, right? And
Yeah.
I think it very much depends on what you're trying to achieve with the types of attacks you initiate. And that is where it's not always a good thing to not be discovered. Like
Mm,
sometimes you actually want the other side to know and understand what's going on because you want to achieve some effect in the information space or what have you. I think
mm,
the hybrid attacks is probably something that NATO and the European countries would be able to manage in different ways without really without it becoming uh, really critical, like something that could uh, potentially threaten our whole sort of existence in terms of the way we are used to living. I think to really challenge the European countries and those organizations that we have, Russia would need in one way or another to trigger Article 5, right? So I think the most dangerous thing, the most dangerous scenario, or I mean, could be that something that is just enough that it ought to trigger Article 5, but where it doesn't, because
Yeah.
some countries are just not going to do that. I say, this is not, it's not worth it. It's too small, right? Uh, that is really significant, a significant threat, and something that I think I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Russia could do that in a time frame that's not too distant. I think one of the things we sometimes forget is that Russia is a country at war, and that countries at war are will be willing to do desperate things to avoid losing that war. And
Yeah.
and also that from Putin's point of view, he actually sees what's going on in Ukraine as a defensive war, because he's thinking about these things from a great power perspective, and in his mind, he's fighting for Russia's position as a great power by standing up to NATO expansion, by ensuring that Ukraine will remain sort of one of those buffer states in Russia's near abroad, and sort of that being forced to be in Russia's sphere of influence, right? That's
Yeah.
in his mind, those are critical aspects of being a great power. And if he does not win that war, then Russia will be on the path to just becoming a nation state like many others and not being a great power. So that in Putin's mind makes the war defensive. And when you're fighting a defensive war, you will be willing to do dramatic things to avoid losing. Um, so I think the closer we get to that point that I talked about, where Russia will be unable to sustain the war that's going on in Ukraine, the more dangerous it actually becomes, because the more wild stuff they will be willing to do and to try to turn the tide. So I think we're going to see more intense hybrid attacks on Europe, and we might even see something that is designed to trigger Article 5.
Everything that you say seems so damn plausible and scary at the same time. My issue here, of course, is when we talk about all of this in total, and we look at the lack of competence among the Western capitals. And I want to be very clear. Yes, the US has problems. However, there are other problems that Europe has as well. And collectively, that's been played on by Putin as a propaganda a hit for him for years. He's always looked at the West as being weak, effete, can't do anything, can't manage. So when you say that things can get very hairy and very dangerous as the war starts to enter its final phases, is it also a case of Putin wanting to push that Europe is weak and can't stand up, for Ukraine, can't stand up for itself, and the Americans are now, doing a completely different thing to what they used to do in terms of supporting NATO. So does he see that there's opportunity for him to create a dangerous situation, and for the West to just basically go through that escalation management situation and just say, nah, nah, we're not going down that path?
I think that's something he might try, right?
Yeah.
Um, I the I'm more and more actually struggling to read Putin's mind in terms of trying to
Mm.
guess what he's going to do, because I think it's important to be aware that this idea that Russia would not win the war in Ukraine, that Russia would not be able to defeat a small state on its border like that, it's totally beyond comprehension for someone like Putin.
Mm.
In The way I see it, he still lives in this bubble where he is absolutely convinced that things are going to turn out all right in the end. And that, I think it's going to be a really, really difficult process for him to start understanding that that's not happening. And
Yeah.
what might he be willing to do when at some point that becomes evident? I don't know. I think it's difficult to predict. Um, eh, I also think that's, these, in some ways, Putin is not he's not a young man anymore. He's also a person who in many ways lives in a bubble of how things used to work, used to be, how they used to work, and um, uh, he hasn't quite understood how the war, the whole world is changing. He wants NATO to start falling apart. He likes what Donald Trump is doing in terms of
Yeah.
undermining the cohesion in NATO, but he has not understood that that actually means that, well, the European countries are going to start doing something, and we need to take them into account. So that's why Putin still believes that he has to make a deal not with Zelensky but with Donald Trump, because
Mm.
obviously it's the great power game. That's the great powers make the rules, right? That's what all this is
Right.
about. And bringing himself into that meeting with Donald Trump, where they can draw the lines on the map and divide Europe. But you know, it is not like the United States is in a position where they can actually make those commitments on behalf of Europe, right? And so I think in many ways, Putin is making decisions in a bubble that doesn't really correspond to reality.
Yeah.
Um, and that makes it really difficult to predict what he's going to do when it becomes evident that this is not working. And I think that might happen as a result of some of the developments we are seeing right now, where we will see emerging fractures within the Russian society if the Ukrainians can sustain the campaign that they have started with long-range airstrikes, for example.
Well, speaking of which, there have been rumors that suggesting that the Trump administration is putting caveats on the use of long-range American weapons in the hands of Ukrainians to prevent the Ukrainians from using those weapons on long-range strikes, which have been having their effect on Russia. What do you think that actually says about where Trump is situating himself in all of this? Because again, we always hear the talk about, he loves Putin, he loves the idea of autocracy, he loves this, he loves that. But, you know, if he's putting caveats on the Ukrainians, he's effectively tying both of Ukraine's hands behind its back while they're fighting this existential struggle for survival. So, what can you say about that?
Uh, the Well, we can say the first thing to acknowledge is that this is not just a Trump thing, that Biden did the same, right? So
Yeah,
these
yeah,
political limitations on what Ukraine can do with the weapons they're given have been there all along. And I think
yeah.
they have been really problematic in terms of they have prolonged the war and they have increased the suffering as a result of the war. I also think this whole thing shows that Donald Trump also has not really understood that his policies mean that the United States will have a reduced influence on the decisions that countries such as Ukraine and the European countries are making. Like, on the one hand, Donald Trump goes around and talks about how he wants to create peace and how he's putting pressure on Ukraine to, because this is necessary. So we see that. But on the other hand, he's also bragging about how he's not actually spending a dime anymore on Ukraine. And so the Americans are not providing any significant support in terms of donations of weapons or anything like that. And that also means that it's a lot less relevant to the Ukrainians what the Americans actually say, because
Yeah.
if they're not actually providing any help, then what's the leverage here? Why would we care what you think? So I think what this whole the constant limitations that Ukraine has been a huge driver in them building their own capacities to do this and
Mm.
building their own weapons where they can just launch these strikes without asking the Americans. And it's kind of ironic. I think, we had these discussions about so-called long-range weapons such as ATACMS, and there are other types as well here, right? But they have ranges of maybe like 300 kilometers or something like that. And that was a huge deal because, oh, is that going to be a red line if Ukraine starts attacking Russia with those kinds of long range weapons with a range of up to 300 kilometers? Now Ukraine has weapons that can reach thousands of kilometers into Russia. So it is increasingly irrelevant that the Americans would put those restrictions on the weapons that Ukraine is given or buys or what they do, because Ukraine has other weapons that can do the same thing. But I think it still shows something about how difficult it is to understand for the Trump administration that Ukraine is not actually a small state, and that Ukraine does not have to necessarily just give in to whatever they say.
Yeah. And as some argue that a frontline freeze, if that were to occur, just buys Russia time to rearm. But from a military perspective, can a freeze ever be stable and therefore a desirable outcome? I mean, who benefits most from a pause, the defender or the aggressor?
Mm, I think um, I don't know if you can put it like that. I think a freeze without security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine would probably just be a pause. Right?
Yeah. Mm.
But if it is accompanied by robust security guarantees that will ensure that it will be really difficult for Russia to restart a war, then it might work. Like then we're probably talking. Then it might look like something like the Korean scenario, right?
Mm.
The thing that people who talk about the Korean scenario for Ukraine, that's something that's often being aired, but people tend to forget that, the reason why that actually works is that they were given massive security guarantees to southern Korea, right? And the American troops are still there. So that is why the Korean scenario worked. And that is something like what we would need to see in Ukraine as well.
Mm.
And then there are, of course, more specific discussions about what would that look like, like exactly who would contribute with what. But I think it is possible to see how you can have a freeze of the front lines, and that being the basis of something that is not going to be hot war again in a handful of years. But it requires those security guarantees.
Before we dive back in, a quick word. If you're enjoying this conversation, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us what you agree with, what you don't, and what you'd like us to cover next. The focus is all about sparking debate and building a community of people who care about the big issues shaping our world. Your voice really helps keep that conversation going. Let's get back in. Anders, Trump has given us three options in the context of what he thinks should go forward. So he's laid out these options, such as he's going to pick a side, didn't say what side he's going to pick. He says there's a possibility that we just let Russia and Ukraine fight it out. Or the third one, we're going to do nothing. So, what do these choices signal to allies and adversaries? And do you see this as a serious policy framework or more of a negotiating tactic aimed at domestic audiences?
I think you can say that inaction is also a kind of action, right? And what we've seen from
Yeah.
Donald Trump has been he's just been delaying decisions from when he came into office and until now. Just always 2 weeks, right? It's always going to
Yeah.
be 2 weeks, and I think that's what's been happening so far, and I think that's the most likely thing to keep on happening. And so we will probably continue seeing the American administration not really put any pressure on Russia.
Yeah.
Um, and but I also think the more significant thing that has happened, I think, over the summer in terms of diplomacy is that some of the uncertainty that came when Donald Trump came in, and there was this whole thing. What are the new rules of the game? The United States was a very big donor of weapons to Ukraine, very strong supporter. Someone else had to take over. I think we've seen the European countries really step up, and I think this agreement that the United States would be a weapons producer on the world stage, that the European countries can buy weapons from and give to Ukraine. That this is what allows Trump to say that they're no longer spending any money on that. In fact, they're making money on the war in Ukraine. I think that has sort of created a framework that is probably going to be the basis going forward for fighting the war here, that we know what the role of the United States is in all this. And others have stepped up and found solutions to all different things. And so I think, and that's why when this Alaska meeting came, there was such big fear that, oh no, all these arrangements we'd made, this was just this whole scheme of selling weapons to European NATO countries that could hand them over to Ukraine. It was just announced in July, just a couple of weeks before the Alaska meeting was announced, and people were like, "Oh no, all these things, are they going to fall away now, or is the United States not going to, like, do we have to start over finding new solutions for how to keep Ukraine fighting?" But I think on the other side of these meetings, it's clear that these things still exist, and both Trump and J.D. Vance and others talk about this as an acceptable situation for the United States. So I think that is going to be the framework going forward. The United States increasingly not really playing an active role, not really putting significant pressure on either side in this, but being, we can say, a weapons production powerhouse that Europe can tap into in exchange for money.
And profiting all the way to the bank.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, if that's what it takes in this current situation, I mean, that is, from a European perspective, an acceptable sort of arrangement.
Okay. Well, so Vice President J.D. Vance said Russia had made significant concessions on Ukraine, though none of these have been released. What can we realistically take away from that kind of statement, Anders? Does floating unspecified concessions strengthen Washington's hand or risk undermining trust if nothing materializes?
I think there are two types of concessions that Trump and Vance are talking about. So Trump is talking about concessions that Putin allegedly made to him in person, such as willingness to meet Zelensky or willingness to accept security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine and those kinds of things. These are things that clearly he just made up. Like there is no way that the Russians actually made those concessions. But I think what Trump is trying to do here is to, fake it till you make it. It's just a negotiation tactic. He keeps talking about this until eventually Putin will have to accept that this is what it is. And I think that's also how we should understand all Trump's talk about how Ukraine will need to give up territories. That's basically him doing the same thing in the opposite direction, right? I don't think Zelensky has ever made any promises like that, but Trump talks about it as if this is just, So he believes that he can actually use this to bring these leaders into a meeting, and then this is how it's going to end. So that's one type of concession, those that Trump clearly just makes up because it's a negotiation tactic. Then there's the other kind of concessions that I think that Vance is talking about here, which basically is that it's something like, well, Russia, it's a concession that Russia has accepted that they are not going to conquer all of Ukraine, for example, or that they are not going to install a puppet regime in Kiev or something like that. That's supposed to be concessions, which is of course kind of strange, right? Because
You're
I mean,
saying.
yeah, it's absolutely not realistic that Russia could do those things, even if they wanted
Yeah,
to, right?
yeah.
So calling that a concession is kind of weird.
Mm,
Um, but I guess yeah, it's it's also a way of trying to just frame the whole thing and say, well, we progress is actually being made, and so I don't know, something that has a domestic audience, I guess, as well, in trying to
mm.
justify the what Donald Trump is doing. We I mean, that's a challenge that Trump has, that he has this kind of Russia friendly or Russia soft approach to this whole thing. But actually, in the United States, there is still strong popular support for Ukraine. So they need to try to justify what they're doing.
If the next 60 days brings no movement in terms of further negotiations, peace, the trilateral summit between Trump, Zelensky, and Putin, what's your worst case escalation scenario? And what single policy choice could reduce that risk? I mean, are there early warning signs that escalation is already underway? I mean, we see the increased levels of bombing that the terror bombing that the Russians are conducting against Ukrainian cities, for instance.
That is probably going to continue. I mean,
Mm,
just the escalating air war is something that both sides have identified as uh, an important uh, an important thing that for them to achieve victory. So I think we're going to see continued escalation both from the Russian but also from the Ukrainian side. I think the things from the Ukrainian side is probably more significant because that's something new that is being brought to the battlefield, where we can say these Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian society have been going on for a longer period of time. So it's not really new in that sense. They're just doing more of it. Mm, I, I think in many ways what we are seeing is that you know the Russians are slowly getting to a point where they're struggling more and more to keep the pressure going. So there are
yeah.
two aspects of this war. There is the air war, where they're trying to put pressure on Ukraine that way, and then they try to put pressure on Ukraine on the front line. And this is not just about winning territory; it's also about putting pressure on the entire Ukrainian society to make that stop. And
Mm.
um, uh, it's clear that it's getting more and more difficult for Russia to keep doing that. And I think one of the big one of those big things that they will eventually have to look at is the whole manning system in the Russian army, and this idea of recruiting only volunteers and paying big bonuses and getting soldiers that way. I think the economic crisis and just the longer this goes on uh, is going to make it more and more difficult for them to find the soldiers they need through those means. And this will force Putin into making some of those types of decisions that he really doesn't want to have to make, like mobilization in Russian society, forced mobilization. Um, and but I think that is probably something we should look for. That if that happens, then that would be a significant sign that the Ukrainian approach is working,
Yeah.
because it forces Putin into finding cheaper and more robust ways of manning the Russian army. Um, so I think I would not expect dramatic escalation in terms of something big and flashy suddenly happening. I would more expect that the things that Russia is doing will become more and more difficult for them, and they will have to escalate in ways like, such as, for example, finding new ways of manning the army and um, doing things like that. I think that would be a first step. Like something we have to all the time remind ourselves when we talk about the escalation risks is that Putin actually hasn't acknowledged internally in Russia that there is a war. It's still
Yeah,
this
yeah.
special military operation, right? So
Mm,
sometimes you'll hear people in the West talking about, well, he could use nuclear weapons or he could, do all kinds
mm,
of crazy, wild things. But if you haven't actually told your own people that there is a war going on, then it's really difficult to make those steps. So I would expect things to happen inside of Russia first, before
mm,
where they would have to acknowledge that this is a real war and try to go more all in on supporting the war effort in the Russian society. That's actually also something that we see those Russian mill bloggers talking about all the time,
mm,
how they are super frustrated that Russia is not all in on the war and that a big part of the Russian society just keep on living their lives if nothing happened and pretending that this is not a big deal or it has nothing to do with them.
mm.
So it is a discussion inside of Russia. But I think there is a chance that we are going to see over the next, maybe not the next 60 days, but over the next year, say, that we are going to see Russia needing to go all in if they want to continue this war. So we are approaching a point where Putin will have to make a decision. Does he really want to keep on fighting or does he want to end it?
I suppose the one cheap and almost short to medium term thing that he can do is double down on whatever he can get from North Korea in terms of soldiers and maybe even put out the call to volunteers in places like Vietnam, Mongolia, maybe in various North African countries who'd be willing to serve in uniform. You can go down this particular track, but it really depends on how people feel about going to the front line and meeting Ukrainian fire. Are they going to be that motivated to get their check at the end of the day to put their lives on the line for Vladimir Putin? I mean, Putin doesn't stand for being the light on the hill unless you think that the light on the hill is an autocracy. So there's no real ideological motive. There's only the cash motive that would be able to incentivize people, foreign people, to move into the ranks of the Russian uniforms and move forward into Ukraine, right?
Mhm. I think it would be really difficult. It would be very hard for me to see North Korean units, for example, coming. I don't think they can, get all these volunteers from around the world. They're doing that already. I think they've hit more or
Mm,
less the limit of how many foreign fighters they can find there. Something
right.
like getting entire North Korean units, North Korean brigades, for example, to fight in Ukraine. I guess that is something that could potentially, maybe they could persuade the North Koreans to do that, but I don't think it would be enough to really change the direction of the war. And also, I think it would be very hard to motivate the Korean fighters to fight the way the Russians are doing it, right? The,
Mm,
the way the
yeah.
reason the Russians uh, can motivate people to go into something that looks like a sure death, right, is because
Mm,
there is such strong discipline in the Russian system, and uh, how can, can you persuade a North Korean commander to send his soldiers into that kind of thing? Like I don't know. And in any case, I don't think it would be enough to really significantly change the direction of things. Something that we actually also need to be aware of is that um, all this talk about how peace might be happening soon, Donald Trump coming into office talking about, well, we're going to reach a deal soon, and all these things,
mm,
that has actually been a boost for Russian mobilization or volunteers signing up because there was this idea that the war is about to end. So
yeah.
many Russians have looked at this and say, I might want to cash in on that sign up bonus, and then the war is
Right.
going to end, and then
Yeah.
it's that's all good.
Mm,
Now, if suddenly the picture changes and it becomes clear that this is not happening, then we might actually see the numbers declining quite significantly in
mm.
Russia. We have actually seen signs already that the number of volunteers might be declining. So yeah.
Okay, so Anders, by the end of September, what three visible signs would equal diplomatic progress, and what three would mean that the Alaska and Washington meetings were setbacks? which of those markers will ordinary people, not just experts, actually notice?
Um, I think the idea that there's going to be a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and then there's going to be some kind of deal. I think that's
Mm,
really uh, unrealistic. That's not
yeah.
going to happen. Both because Putin does not want to meet Zelensky for a range of reasons, but also because that's just not how this is done, right? You,
Mm,
you don't actually get the presidents in there to negotiate all the sort of minute details of things, right?
mm,
The
mm.
presidents come in at the end after there is a kind of uh, agreement already, and we just need to sign the papers. So
Yeah.
I think to get into a real process that would require people meeting at a different level. The Istanbul format did not work because the Russians kept sending people who were really nobodies there. Yeah, so they were not at a sufficient level here. But on the other hand, I think Zelensky goes around talking about how the only way forward is a meeting between him and Putin personally. I think that's just him trying to parrot what Donald Trump is saying.
Mm,
I don't
mm,
really see it leading to anything significant, even if they were to meet. So what I would be looking for would be some kind of process at a pretty high level, but not the presidential level, to actually start materializing. Um,
mhm.
so that would be one step. Then you can also say, well, what are what are significant steps? Like, is that necessarily something about making Ukraine and Russia agree on something, or could it be something else? Because I actually think something fruitful that has come out of this Washington and Alaska meetings, like that is the discussion about security guarantees. That
Mhm.
is now all over the news everywhere. What could they look like, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite clear that Putin has not actually agreed to any security guarantees, but now there is a discussion about this in the West, and countries are debating with themselves, how are we going to contribute here, and what might work, and ideas are being shared. And I think we might get to a point where some of those things might even begin to materialize, or very sort of concrete ideas about it might take shape
Mhm.
over the coming months. And I think that will be significant in terms of creating the conditions for the war to end at some point.
And as there's been talk that the United States is going to be taking unspecified military action against the Maduro regime in Venezuela. So some ships apparently have been deployed. There's a likelihood of Marines also accompanying those ships. And let's assume for the moment that such an expedition were to take place. Would a would a demonstration of American firepower to change the political situation on the ground in Venezuela act as a signal to Putin in some indirect way?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we saw the same thing with Iran, right? Donald
Yeah, yeah,
Trump
yeah.
was willing to use kinetic force against Iran.
Mm,
That did not change anything. I think
mm,
Putin feels very confident that there's not going to be any sort of direct American involvement or action against him like that. So no, I don't think he's concerned about that. I think he is probably a bit concerned about sanctions, and the possibility that the Americans could dial up those either directly on Russia or on third countries that trade with Russia. But
mhm,
I think the bigger so that's one thing that Putin is concerned about, and the other
yeah,
thing that he might still think could potentially happen is the United States returning to donating weapons to Ukraine.
right.
I think that's something he would be concerned about as well. So
Mm.
that's a more meaningful thing to threaten with. That if you don't do something, we're going to start again donating weapons to Ukraine. I think, um, yeah, that's more concerning to him than whatever Donald Trump does against Venezuela.
Okay. Anyway, Anders, thanks for joining us again and for sharing your insights on the focus.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Commander Anders Puck Nielsen from the Royal Danish Defence College in Copenhagen. As we've heard today, the Alaska and White House summits raise more questions than answers. For Ukraine, for Europe, and for NATO, the real issue isn't just what leaders say behind closed doors, it's whether those words translate into lasting security and real commitments. In the end, the choices made now will echo for years. Will this be remembered as the moment the West held firm, or the moment it drifted? That's the challenge facing us all. Now on to questions for the audience. Do you think the Alaska and White House summits were serious diplomacy or just political theater? If you were a key Washington insider, which of Trump's three options on Ukraine would you choose and why? Do you believe Europe can stand on its own if US support weakens, or is the United States still the only real guarantor of European security? Let us know in the comment section below. If you found today's conversation useful, subscribe to The Focus on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads for more analysis and updates. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Until next time, stay informed and stay focused. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.